A single, instantaneous sound split the frozen night above Pripyat. A blast. Concrete shivered. Glass trembled in office windows. Orange fire flared over the reactor block like a second dawn. Steam and the smell of hot metal moved through corridors. Red alarm lights began to cycle in the control room. Men on the night shift rose from chairs and ran. They ran before they understood where the sound had come from. April 26th, 1986. 1:23 a.m. 1:23 and 40 seconds. Official logs later recorded a violent power excursion and explosion. It occurred in Reactor 4. The reactor core was exposed to the open sky. Highly radioactive material was thrown out of the building. The blast ripped the roof from the reactor hall. Massive concrete slabs collapsed. Steel supports twisted like paper. Heat and flame licked the exposed core. The reactor's graphite moderator ignited and began to burn. Burning graphite was not an ordinary industrial fire. It fed a sustained high-temperature blaze on the ruined roof. That fire lofted radioactive particles into the upper atmosphere. It continued to throw contamination skyward for days. The control room sat 4 floors below the crippled core. Instruments glowed, then jumped into unreadable extremes. Some meters pegged high, others went dead. Alarms screamed in patterns the operators had never memorized. Operators shouted to each other across concrete. They compared readings. They followed procedures learned for other emergencies. Their checklist did not cover a burning reactor open to the sky. A pipe burst in a service corridor. Steam poured like white ghosts. A workshop table dumped its tools in a metallic clatter. A clock on a nearby wall stopped mid-tick. The sound of collapse echoed through heavy doors and stairwells. Men closed their eyes for a second and then climbed toward the smoke. Some at the plant first thought a turbine had exploded. Turbine failures were familiar. Reactor explosions were not. That confusion bought time and cost lives. Communication scrambled as managers tried to frame what they saw. In a log entry, technicians would later write the dry phrase violent power excursion. Clinical words tried to contain an event that had unbound the core. Language in the morning would not match the heat of the night. Fragments of fuel and graphite lay scattered on the frozen roof. They smouldered and threw a bitter, choking smoke into the air. Flames crawled over concrete slabs and piping. Firefighters arrived with hoses and ladders within minutes. They climbed toward heat that no training had prepared them for. They didn't understand they were standing in an invisible cloud. Many inhaled contamination directly as they battled flames. Some were fatally exposed before anyone called an alarm for radiation. A plume rose into the pre-dawn sky like a living column. It glowed orange against the cold. Updraft and wind carried radioactive soot high over the plain. Particles rode thermal currents into the night and away from the plant. Within hours, sensors far beyond Ukraine would register strange isotopes. Monitors in neighbouring countries would puzzle over unexplained readings. Outside Pripyat, snow steamed where particles landed and vaporized. A white field turned grey with toxic dust. Roofs, playgrounds and vegetable gardens collected invisible grit. There was no smell that marked radioactivity, only the smell of burning. People would later describe a metallic taste in their mouths. Inside the reactor hall, the geometry of destruction was hard and simple. A roof torn open removed the final barrier between fuel and sky. A fire fed by graphite meant emission could not be quenched quickly. The plant had no containment dome capable of holding that kind of breach. That structural reality turned one violent minute into a prolonged release. Back at management centres, messages moved up slow, bureaucratic chains. Officials who needed exact numbers did not yet have them. Some instruments reported numbers that seemed impossible. Others were blinded by heat and radiation. Decision-makers received fragments of data and fragments of opinion. Secrecy and routine reporting habits slowed urgent clarity from flowing outward. For the men on the roof, the problem was immediate and mortal. They threw water and sand where they could. They used crowbars and shovels to expose burning pieces. They did what was necessary with what was at hand. Their choices in those first hours would be written into hospital reports later. A minute of rupture rewired the plant into an emergency zone. A literal hole in concrete became a symbolic breach of safety. Radiation that had been contained inside metal and design was now airborne. That shift made the accident not only an engineering failure, but a public health event. It required responses that stretched beyond the control room and into cities. By dawn, smoke drifted toward Belarus and across western Russia. By afternoon, Scandinavian monitoring stations recorded anomalous radioactivity. Diplomats and engineers in other capitals would soon begin to ask questions. The event was local in space and global in consequence. Few of the first responders imagined the long arc of damage. They dealt with fire, with falling debris, and with an urgent human instinct to help. Some would become ill within hours. Others would develop symptoms over weeks. For many more, exposure would be invisible and counted later. The night the atom broke was not a slow collapse. It was an instantaneous physical rupture that then unspooled for days. The explosion violently exposed fuel to the open air. The burning moderator fed emissions that moved with wind and weather. Those two facts, breach and burn, made Chernobyl unique among industrial disasters. In the immediate glare, plant staff and local firefighters improvised. They crawled over twisted metal to reach embers. They carried hoses up ladders and tossed them onto smouldering rubble. They were not protected from the worst of a radioactive cloud. They demonstrated the kind of human courage that emergencies always demand. The consequences of one explosive minute were measured in hours and in kilometres. They were also measured in the bodies that absorbed doses without knowing. The political and scientific consequences would be measured in reports and hearings. The human consequences would be measured in hospitals, graves, and quiet family stories. One small metallic sound in the night became a hinge in history. 1:23 and 40 seconds remained the moment from which everything flowed. It set an international crisis in motion. It started a human catastrophe that would be tallied in disease, displacement, and loss. Hold the image of a frozen roof catching flame beneath a pale moon. Hold the sound of concrete fracturing and men calling to each other. Hold the clinical line, violent power, excursion, and explosion. Hold the technical fact. The core was exposed and radioactive material entered the open air. These facts are the pivot from which the rest of the story unfolds. Tomorrow we will follow the design, the decisions, and the people who were in the room. Tonight we keep to this 1 minute, this sharp hinge of history. A spread of drawings lay flat on a cold metal table. Concrete plans, graphite bricks, a web of fuel channels. There was a conspicuous absence. No Western-style containment dome. He was an engineer used to blueprints stained with coffee and smoke. His gloves left dark smudges on the paper. He traced a ring of circles that marked fuel channels. Each circle promised a pencil-thin tube running deep into the reactor core. He could almost feel the length of those tubes under his fingertips. He could hear the imagined hum of pumps too distant to be comforting. This plant used an RBMK 1000 reactor. RBMK stood for a channel-type design built by Soviet engineers. Instead of a single pressure vessel, the core was a lattice of graphite. Hundreds of vertical channels crossed the graphite blocks like strings in a harp. Fuel assemblies slid into those channels like pencils into tubes. Water flowed through each channel, carrying heat away from the fuel. The graphite slowed neutrons so they would split uranium atoms more often. The building around the core was large and hollow. It felt more like an industrial workshop than a sealed vault. Down the hall, cranes lifted heavy graphite bricks with ease. The reactor hall was open. The design allowed workers to walk above the channels. Technicians could refuel while the reactor kept running. That feature saved time and money for the Soviet energy program. On paper, the trade-off looked practical and patriotic. There was another trade-off hidden in the physics. Water performed two jobs inside the RBMK. It carried heat away from fuel rods. It also absorbed some neutrons, acting as a brake on the chain reaction. When water boiled into steam, those breaking neutrons disappeared. Steam pockets formed inside channels. Those pockets were called voids. Positive void coefficient. When voids grew, the reactor could unexpectedly speed up. The graphite continued to moderate neutrons. The water no longer absorbed them. The balance of reactions shifted toward more fission. A small increase in steam volume could produce a large jump in power. Under certain operating conditions, the effect became dangerously nonlinear. A slow, measured system could lurch into a surge. Control rods were supposed to stop that surge. Operators inserted rods to absorb neutrons and slow the reaction. But the RBMK control rods had a graphite element at their tips. Graphite displaced water when the rods entered the channels. For a few heartbeats, inserting a rod added moderation instead of removing it. That brief window raised reactivity before the absorber section took effect. Graphite-tipped control rods. Imagine a safety device that for an instant makes the danger worse. Imagine reaching for an emergency brake that shoves the accelerator instead. Those moments were short. They were also decisive if the reactor teetered. Under normal power, the net effect of rod insertion proved safe enough. Under low power, with steam pockets and altered neutron flows, the rods behaved differently. The reactor could be stable and compliant in routine operation. It could become unstable when conditions changed. Operational convenience had created a conditional fragility. Online refueling and high power output favored Soviet energy needs. Those same features complicated the reactor's response to unexpected transients. The physicality of the core made the abstract danger tactile. Graphite blocks were rough and heavy in the hands of fitters. Steel pressure tubes ran like veins through the moderator. Crewmen could point to a specific channel and imagine how steam would collect. They could visualize how a control rod would push out water and briefly replace it with moderator. None of that lived on the clean lines of a single containment dome. Containment, as Western engineers imagined it, was not part of that layout. Many Western reactors were enclosed by a thick, continuous concrete shell. That shell aimed to contain explosions and keep radiation from escaping. Chernobyl's reactor had concrete and a serviceable roof. It lacked a continuous, reinforced containment vessel large enough to hold a core breach. The absence mattered in plain, immediate terms. If an explosion ripped the top from the core, there was a clear path to the sky. Radioactive particles and gases could be thrown directly into the atmosphere. Weather would carry them across borders in hours, not decades. A design decision on one table could become an international event. Choices in engineering often follow political priorities. The RBMK 1000 was a product of Soviet planning and resource constraints. It was cheap to build per megawatt. It produced heat useful for industry and cities. Its ability to refuel without shutdown suited a state keen on continuous output. Those priorities shaped features that later turned lethal when combined with human error. Blueprints show intent. They also hide assumptions. Engineers assumed operating crews would follow procedures closely. Designers assumed certain power ranges would not be breached. Those assumptions lived on paper until an unusual test challenged them. The design's tolerances and the operator's choices would meet in the control room. On the table, the drawings recorded tolerances in fine print. They specified rod insertion speeds and emergency trip logics. They noted the acceptable void coefficient range. They did not feel urgent in the quiet drafting room. They did not smell like the graphite dust that settled in the workshop. There were early warnings buried in technical reports and internal memos. Some engineers flagged the positive void coefficient as problematic in non-standard conditions. Others worried about the graphite tips on the control rods. The concerns did not change decades of production-oriented policy overnight. Design evolution proceeded slowly across ministries and priorities. The reactor was not a single faulty part. It was a system of compromises embedded into concrete and steel. Each compromise had a purpose that made sense at the time. Each compromise also opened a pathway for failure under stress. Consider the chain reaction in everyday language. Neutrons split atoms, releasing heat. Heat boils water. Boiled water becomes steam. Steam reduces neutron absorption and can let the chain reaction run faster. Control rods can absorb neutrons and restore balance, but their graphite tips change the initial response. When these elements align, the reactor's behaviour can flip in seconds. That flip is what engineers feared in theoretical exercises. They modelled worst-case transients and held meetings about mitigations. They fitted automatic scrams and interlocks where possible. Some fixes arrived in later reactor models. Some fixes were never fully implemented at older stations. For the man at the table, the blueprints told a quieter truth. The core was a lived space with grooves and gaps where physics could take unexpected paths. Safety lived at the intersection of hardware, software, procedure and habit. When any one of those aspects weakened, the others were forced to compensate. This reactor's architecture made compensation precarious. A single test on a low-power state could expose latent vulnerabilities. Simple procedures could have complex, dangerous consequences. The RBMK 1000 embodied a pattern of trade-offs. High output and operational convenience came at the price of conditional instability. Designers and politicians had not built a monster. They had built a machine optimized for certain goals. They had not fully accepted how those optimizations behaved outside normal envelopes. The blueprint suspected no moral failing. The choices reflected an era's pressures and priorities. On the cold table, the drawings lay like a map to a future accident. Concrete, graphite bricks, fuel channels, no containment dome. The issue was not a single flaw. It was a constellation of choices. Those choices would transform a night of tests into a morning of catastrophe. Understanding that architecture is the key to understanding how the accident became possible. A cigarette stub cooled in an ashtray under the humming lights. A wristwatch, its face smudged, stopped at 1:23 a.m. A thermostat dial had been turned down to save heat. In that small room sat 3 men with names and ranks. Alexander Akimov stood over a bank of analog dials. Anatoly Dyatlov moved through the consoles with clipped certainty. Leonid Toptunov sat at the primary control desk, hands steady. Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer who had charge that night. He was the man who had ordered and overseen the planned experiment. Akimov was the shift supervisor responsible for the operators on duty. Toptunov was the senior reactor control engineer at the console. He was relatively inexperienced on this particular reactor type. Those facts mattered because authority shaped what the others would do. They were running a test that required shutting off some automatic systems. The test had been delayed once and needed completion before dawn. Management pressure and a strict schedule weighed on the control room. That pressure translated into orders and into choices on the floor. To run the experiment, some protective interlocks were deliberately disabled. Those devices existed to stop the reactor when parameters went unsafe. Removing them turned trained men into the final active safety system. Dyatlov's manner filled the room like a clock. He spoke with the voice of someone used to being obeyed. His instructions left little room for debate from subordinates. A culture of deference and discipline had taught them to comply. They had been taught procedures. They had not been trained for doubt. The console hummed. Meters ticked in a narrow, ragged chorus. Small noises settled into muscle memory over long shifts. A valve clicked. A relay snapped. A faint alarm blinked and went dim. Outside, corridors were empty, and the station slept. Inside, the men kept the reactor's heart in their hands. They reduced power to reach the test conditions. That reduction carried a well-known danger called xenon poisoning. Xenon is a fission product that absorbs neutrons and kills reactivity. At low power, that effect can make a reactor go quiet and stubborn. When the reactor balked, Toptunov moved the rods to raise output. He pulled them back to coax the core into producing more power. Each rod removed increased the reactor's sensitivity to small changes. The instruments did not agree with each other. Some gauges said flux was dangerously low. Others suggested local neutron counts were climbing in isolated channels. Wide-range detectors were unreliable at very low power levels. Operators were forced to infer the cause condition from piecemeal signals. That inference was brittle under stress and under night fatigue. Toptunov worked the levers with a steady face. He had learned procedures and he followed them quickly. He asked permission before major actions because that was the discipline. Akimov repeated measurements aloud and watched for any odd movements. Dyatlov listened, issued orders, and moved to the next console. His presence turned uncertainty into a command to proceed. There was a moment when Akimov hesitated. He suggested pausing to let power stabilize. Dyatlov countermanded him and insisted the experiment continue. That private exchange sealed the room's decisions for the next minutes. They had removed more rods than the reactor's designers expected under those conditions. The margin for error had been reduced to the thickness of a hand. The core was effectively bare in several channels near a critical boundary. At that boundary, small changes produced huge power swings. Then the readings changed in ways none of their charts predicted. Power dropped towards zero and the needles of the panel swung. Lights dimmed in corners of the room as instruments recalculated. They watched the reactor seem to die, and then suddenly surge. The surge arrived faster than any of them had practiced for. 1:23 a.m. Meters leapt from low to high in a jagged pulse. Alarms began to bark with overlapping tones. They saw numbers that contradicted the smooth theory they knew. Akimov and Toptunov reacted to what their hands felt on the controls. They moved rods, reversed actions, and argued with the instruments. Every motion produced another conflicting reading and more ambiguity. They were responding to experience and to orders at once. Toptunov did what he had been trained to do with trembling hands. Akimov called out measured values and watched for a steady trend. Dyatlov ordered interventions with the certainty of a man who believed in protocol. None of them possessed a single clear picture of the whole core. Outside the glass of the console, the plant systems carried on. Inside the room, the men had lost the comfort of the automatic protections. They had been required to be human safeguards acting in real time. Human judgment replaced interlocks and sensors whose logic they had overridden. The control room became claustrophobic in a way numbers cannot show. Noise sharpened. Decisions fragmented into rapid, isolated commands. The operators' voices rose in short bursts and practical phrases. They spoke of insertion, withdrawal, and pressure in clipped technical words. Those words were attempts to translate an impossible condition into action. Design flaws in the reactor magnified every small misstep. Control rods had graphite tips that behaved oddly at insertion. Under certain conditions, those graphite tips initially increased reactivity. The machine's architecture allowed a brief, dangerous surge during a shutdown. These engineering specifics sat in the background of the men's choices. The operators did not see the geometry of neutrons in their dials. When the core surged, it did so in a handful of channels first. Local power spikes outran the station's ability to register them centrally. The men could not know the full shape of the reaction developing inside. They had only partial, contradictory corroboration from the instruments. They acted on fragments. They acted on authority. They acted on habit. Akimov kept repeating orders as if rhythm would restore clarity. Toptunov tried to follow every instruction and also to warn of limits. Dyatlov enforced the experiment's completion despite rising uncertainty. Those choices were human and urgent and grievous in their consequences. Then something broke that could not be fixed by levers or voice. A shockwave rocked the room. Metal groaned. Some meters went dead. A bright, unnatural light washed through the panels. Alarms became a chaotic chorus, then fell silent in patches. The men smelled ozone and overheated insulation, and the metallic tang of failure. They moved from technicians into witnesses of a breach. Training let them act in the first seconds to protect what they could. They attempted shutdowns and manual overrides with the last tools they had. Their actions were immediate, instinctive, and framed by orders from minutes earlier. Afterwards, Inquiries would pass every gesture and command. Trials would ask why a deputy chief engineer had pressed forward. Reports would point to rods, graphite tips, xenon, and design flaws. Those are all parts of the truth. They are not the whole story. Inside the control room were men making choices under layered pressures. Fatigue, culture, hierarchy, and the weight of schedules shape those choices. A single button or a single withdrawn rod did not cause the catastrophe alone. A system of expectations and design and time amplified a chain of small errors. It is important to name names and actions without demonizing the individuals. Dyatlov, Akimov, and Toptunov were real men with real responsibilities. They took actions that night that would be judged and studied for decades. Those actions occurred in a room where authority and ambiguity met. The story of that room teaches a blunt lesson about complex systems. Machines will amplify small mistakes when human oversight has no easy stop. When safety measures are removed and schedules dominate, risk concentrates. The men at those consoles made decisions with the tools and culture they had. What happened in that control room did not absolve the reactor's designers. It did not absolve managers who demanded tests under bad conditions. It did not erase the fact that, for a few minutes, 3 men held the fate of many. That is why the portraits of the control room men matter to history. Logbook entry: planned test of turbine safety on the evening of our April 25th. The aim was simple on paper: simulate a power outage, see whether the steam turbines could keep the cooling pumps turning. By time, keep pumps running until backup diesel generators started. A routine resilience check, a procedure practiced elsewhere in the Soviet system. The crew treated it as a checklist. The log recorded tasks and times, but the procedure required the reactor to run in an unusual way. The reactor had to be brought down to a very low power level. That step would expose a quirk of the RBMK design. At low power, the reactor behaved differently. It stopped damping transients the way it did at normal output. Steam bubbles could no longer be ignored. They changed the reactor's response. Physics would amplify small changes instead of smoothing them out. And the test required more than physics to be rearranged. It required safety measures to be silenced. For the experiment to proceed, some automatic protections were disabled. Those systems were designed to stop abnormal events without human input. They would normally end a dangerous transient before it grew. During the test, they were intentionally put aside. The motif of the night was silence where alarms should have been. Keys were moved, switches were turned, protection circuits were bypassed. Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer, approved the continuation. Nikolai Fomin, the plant's chief engineer, had authorized the plan earlier. Alexander Akimov supervised the night shift in the control room. Leonid Toptunov handled reactor control at the panel. People with names, ranks, and responsibilities made the calls. They were not acting in a vacuum. The test had been scheduled by protocol. Grid managers wanted an answer. The ministry expected the procedure completed. Delays earlier in the evening pushed the work past midnight. Fatigue was a factor. Clocks marked the small hours, and the plant's control room was a place of habit and trust. Operators trusted instruments. They trusted systems. They trusted the machine's automatic safety. For this test, they asked the machine to trust them back. To accomplish the experiment, they reduced reactor power. They pushed the core toward a marginal state. This was a dangerous place for an RBMK to sit. At low power, a positive void coefficient could dominate behavior. That phrase names a simple consequence. Steam replaces water. Steam carries fewer neutrons away. The chain reaction can accelerate. The reactor's graphite moderators and the water coolant behave together in a way that amplified voids. Small increases in steam could cause the reactor to make more steam. The loop fed itself. More steam, more fission. A vicious circle in miniature. Engineers knew this. The designers had warned about it elsewhere. Yet the test required them to operate within that window. The crew tried to manage the hazard with manual controls. They withdrew many control rods to lift power from its low point. They kept the reactor on a knife edge, balancing reactivity against the test's constraints. Automatic trips that would normally arrest excursions were switched off or bypassed. The emergency protection systems tied to steam pressure and turbine behaviour were disabled. The rationale was bureaucratic and practical. The test would not work if an automatic trip occurred. Operators feared that normal safety response would interrupt the single-minute measurement they needed. So they removed layers of defence to keep a narrow experiment running. Each disabled device was a mechanical quieting of caution. Each bypass was a small removal of margin. The machine became more dependent on human judgment than on engineering safeguards. Human judgment is excellent at routine. It is less reliable in surprise. After midnight, the test proceeded. The turbine was prepared to coast after generator disconnection. Steam flow would be reduced. The turbine would supply the essential pumps by inertia. Diesel backup would be called to life. The plan was straightforward in sequence, but the reactor's power fell lower than intended earlier in the evening. Control room instruments showed power dropping into the unstable regime. Operators attempted to recover power by manual rod withdrawal. That action left significant parts of the core without emergency control. The margin of control shrank to a dangerous minimum. More than one safety net had been removed. The experiment walked an exposed beam. A recoverable transient requires at least one functioning net. The nets were absent. Where the machine once had automatic brakes, there was now only steady hands and calling voices. And voices can be mistaken. Hands can be slow. Eyes can misread dials. The reactor's inherent tendency at low power meant that when conditions changed, power would not just move, it could accelerate exponentially. A slow, controllable adjustment could become a runaway. What should have been a brief engineering demonstration became a recipe for disaster if conditions tilted. There were secondary design features that would make recovery even harder. Control rods had graphite tips to improve steady control during normal operation. Under the conditions they created, those graphite tips would behave dangerously during a rapid insertion. The very rods meant to halt fission would for a moment increase reactivity. That paradox lay inside the hardware. Men could not change that detail in the night. So the test suspended not only automatic systems but the advantage of design wisdom. A technical safety had been removed. The mechanical paradox awaited activation. The stage, in plain language, was set. A reactor operating at an unusually low power level. Most control rods withdrawn. Automatic protections turned off. A turbine test that would change steam flows and pressures. Small shifts in steam could now induce large changes in core behaviour. A single mistake could cascade. The chain of events required only that one critical trigger occur. That is what the logbook did not say. The log contained times and signatures. It could not record the physics that would soon wake inside the core. It did not capture the human tensions in the control room. It could not weigh fatigue against protocol or pride against prudence. Shortly before the experiment began, voices in the control room argued about procedure. Minutes passed while the plant moved through its checklist. Deliberations lengthened the night. Those minutes changed the crew on duty. A fresh shift arrived briefly. The continuity of expertise frayed. Then they proceeded. The turbine generator was signalled to disconnect from the grid. The turbine began to coast. Steam flow decreased. The pumps continued on residual power. At that precise instant, the reactor was in its most vulnerable configuration. There were no automatic gates to stop what physics might do next. What was meant to reassure plant resilience instead opened a window of acute hazard. A simple experiment to prove redundancy had removed redundancy itself. The test had transformed safety into risk. That was the outcome no checklist could foresee. And in that transformed space, ordinary human decisions acquired extraordinary consequences. One by one, routine measures were inverted into dangers. A silent panel, a switched-off relay, a control rod half withdrawn. They were small things that together created a condition for catastrophe. By dawn, the consequences would speak louder than any logbook entry. But for now, the night held its last technical decision. The operators pressed forward. The machinery obeyed. The plant moved from test into a sequence that physics would finish without asking permission. There was a fire in the turbine hall. Sirens answered like a throat opening in the dark. Engines rolled out from Pripyat's fire station within minutes. Headlights cut the night. They threw long, hard beams across metal and steam. The crews expected a turbine fire. They did not expect a reactor exposed. Men in helmets climbed through smoke onto the reactor building's roof. The roof was a war zone of glowing debris and black dust. Heat hit faces like a hand. The air tasted of metal and ash. Boots found buckled hot metal beneath a carpet of burning fragments. They pried open panels and shoved hoses into glowing holes. Their orders were simple and urgent. Put out visible flames. Prevent the blaze spreading. Many of the first trucks came from the plant itself. Many more came from nearby Pripyat. The brigade slept until the alarm. Their uniforms were blue and practical. They lacked specialized radiation suits. Dosimeters were on some belts. Most instruments read like normal for a while. Meters designed for routine plant levels saturated and failed at extreme readings. Men believed the instruments. They trusted metal needles and small numbers. They moved closer to red-hot pieces that were actually fragments of the core. Those fragments were graphite and fuel clumps. They were intensely radioactive. Some firefighters lifted glowing chunks with gloved hands. Some used shovels. They threw burning pieces down into the snow and ditches. They hoped to smother them. Water hissed and steamed from hoses. Steam rose carrying dust into the night. The steam and flames created a buoyant column that pulled particles high. Burning graphite acted like a chimney. Radioactive particles rode that heat column upward. Iodine and cesium and other fragments joined the plume and climbed into the sky. Once aloft, the wind became a transport system across forests and countries. Across Europe, monitoring stations would later register strange spikes of radioactivity. But that was hours and days away. Here, on the roof, the danger was immediate. Faces swollen with sweat, eyes burning from smoke and strange chemical tang. Hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Fingers cramped around hoses and crowbars. A firefighter looked at his watch. He did not yet feel the worst. The worst waited, invisible and patient. Radiation has no smell and no immediate sting. The body registers some effects later in ways that are cruel and clinical. Nausea came quickly for many. Vomiting began within hours for some men. Their skin reddened and then blistered. Hair began to thin and fall in clumps. Simple cuts became ghastly wounds. Infections followed. Internal systems failed. Doctors later called it acute radiation sickness. To the men it felt like poison. They were sent to local hospitals after being pulled from the roof. Pripyat's medical staff were overwhelmed and uncertain about contamination. Patients' clothing was cut away and bagged. Families were kept in the dark. Some firefighters were transferred to Moscow for specialized treatment of their burns. Hospital wards filled with rigid men whose bodies were shutting down. Within 3 months, 28 emergency workers and plant staff died from acute radiation sickness. Vasily Ignatenko. He was 24 when he fought on that roof. His name became a symbol of the night. His face would be photographed later, gaunt and burned. Others were named in lists and files. Vladimir Pravik and Nikolai Titnok were among them. Leonid Telyatnikov led rescue teams and survived. He later spoke about confusion and courage. Their bravery was immediate and unquestioned. Their knowledge was limited. They were trained to fight ordinary fires, not to measure invisible streams of ionizing energy. Plant systems and protocols had not prepared a crew for a core breach and a graphite conflagration. Graphite is a moderator inside RBMK reactors. It slows neutrons and helps sustain a reaction. When it's exposed and hot, it can burn. Burning graphite releases fine, contaminated particles. Those particles are the problem. They are small, light, and easily carried by air. When a reactor core breaks open, the fuel itself becomes aerosolized. Tiny droplets go airborne. Those droplets contain short-lived iodine and longer-lived cesium and other dangerous isotopes. Wind and weather then decide the map of contamination. Fires create vertical lift. Rain can bring contamination down in concentrations. On the night at Chernobyl, the fire created an efficient conveyor belt from ruined core to sky. Back on the roof, men worked until their bodies refused to move. Some could still make jokes between hose pulls. Others were already quiet and shivering. A commander ordered rotations. Men returned to make room for fresh crews. Those rotations were not decontamination plans. They were gestures of endurance. The material they wrestled with clung to clothing, hair, and skin. A jacket folded into a chair became a contamination source inside a fire truck. A boot left by a bed took radioactive dust to a hospital ward. Officials later learned how quickly contamination migrates with human movement. In the immediate hours, the emphasis was on visible threat reduction. Those decisions had consequences. They minimized fire spread but maximized human exposure. Some firefighting techniques helped. They prevented the blaze from taking hold in adjacent blocks. Other actions, however, made the airborne plume worse. Steam jets lofted particles into the air. Chains of cause and effect here did not respect intent. Every choice had a cost. Back at the scene, radios struggled to convey accurate readings and directives. A dispatcher advised firefighters not to approach certain levels. Those messages arrived late or not at all. The culture of secrecy and command rigidity in Soviet institutions slowed transparent communication. That failure compounded human risk. Men assumed they were safe until symptoms proved otherwise. Once symptoms emerged, hospitals lacked proper protocols and facilities for radiation casualties. Doctors used gauze and saline and pain management. They tried to stop internal bleeding. New therapies were experimental, and mortality remained high for those heavily exposed. Outside, the glowing ruin kept giving off heat and radioactive dust for days. Helicopters dropped water and sand and boron onto the exposed core in a desperate attempt to smother fire and limit fission. That aerial effort also stirred and redistributed contamination. It was an exercise in tragic trade-offs. Within 48 hours, weather patterns had already moved the cloud across Belarus and into Europe. Air and soil would hold different isotopes in different ways. Milk and vegetables could concentrate iodine and cesium. Governments far from the Soviet border would later find changes on their instruments. But the earliest casualties were local, human, and immediate. Their names became pages in clinical reports and lines in memorials. Families received notices, sometimes vague and late. Many funerals were small and private. The cost of those first hours was more than physical. It was also social and moral. Communities lost husbands, sons, and neighbours who had simply gone to put out a fire. Those men had expected to return to dinner tables and sacred routines. Instead, they became the first public faces of a disaster no one had yet fully understood. In the first hours, bravery met blindness. Courage met an enemy without smell or sight. A firefighter's hands can become loaded with radiation while still being praised for doing his job. That paradox is the cruel heart of this phase of the catastrophe. It turned a technical accident into a human tragedy whose ripples would cross borders and decades. The sirens that first night did not only warn of fire, they also announced a new kind of danger. They announced the moment when ordinary people faced extraordinary invisible risk. They announced a chain reaction of exposure, hospital rooms, and deaths that could have been lessened with different information. They announced, finally, that the heroism of those men would be written into every later decision about the site. Their sacrifice forced the state to confront containment, evacuation, and cleanup in harsher terms. It also forced the world to see how quickly a local emergency can become an international crisis. Those who climbed onto that roof did not know the full scale of what they touched. They felt the heat, the ash, the metallic tang. They felt fear and duty in equal measure. They fought a fire they could not see. They paid with their bodies and lives. What happened to them in those fractured dawn hours is the human ledger of Chernobyl's earliest cost. A thin, insistent click breaks the hush of a Swedish control room at Forsmark. Forsmark sits 1,000 kilometres west of the ruined reactor at Chernobyl. A technician reads an alarm and frowns at the rising numbers. Click. April 28, 1986. Monitors show gamma radiation climbing above normal background levels. The readings do not fit any local equipment fault. Plant staff notify national authorities and begin internal checks. They alert the International Atomic Energy Agency through established channels. Click. Across Northern Europe, other instruments tell the same story. Automatic samplers trap particles in the air. Radiation counters in Norway and Finland rise steadily. Pilots report odd instrument readings and a metallic taste in their mouths. Meteorologists trace the plume on wind charts heading south from the Soviet Union. Laboratories identify traces of cesium and iodine among the particles. Cesium-137 and iodine-131 signal a reactor release. Click. In Moscow, the sound is different. State television carries the usual programming. Newspapers print the day's official schedule and stock market numbers. Radio announcers speak of sports and culture. No urgent bulletin interrupts the flow. When Soviet spokesmen do answer, they call it a minor incident at an unnamed plant. They refuse to give location or scale. They ask for patience. Click. That silence has practical consequences. Local officials receive slow, partial instructions. Evacuation plans move in bureaucratic stages rather than by emergency order. School children continue classes. Farmers milk their cows and send produce to market. Hospitals do not receive broad directives about iodine prophylaxis. Potassium iodide is not distributed as a precaution. Iodine-131 taken into the body through milk concentrates in the thyroid gland. Children absorb it more readily than adults. The hours left unprotected leave a measurable imprint on public health. Click. Foreign detection forces the issue into public view. The International Atomic Energy Agency presses Moscow for information. Faced with external data, Soviet officials change their tune. Moscow formally notifies the agency about an accident at a nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The admission is blunt and late. It offers neither a clear casualty count nor a comprehensive public safety plan. Click. Satellites and reconnaissance imagery fill other blanks. Spaceborne sensors map thermal anomalies over the reactor complex. Weather satellites chart the slow drift of the plume across national borders. Reconnaissance photographs show a roof torn open and charred earth below. Those images reach national capitals before they reach ordinary Soviet citizens. They corroborate what monitors have already registered on the ground. Click. The pattern is simple and corrosive. External detectors click. Foreign scientists map the spread. International journalists publish plume models. Meanwhile, Soviet media offers guarded bulletins and political reassurances. Every external data point that contradicts the official line deepens domestic and international suspicion. Click. Practical measures follow rapidly outside the Soviet Union. Schools are ordered indoors in parts of Scandinavia. Milk distribution is restricted in several regions. Fresh leafy vegetables receive special testing. Border controls on dairy and produce tighten. Researchers from multiple countries cooperate to model deposition patterns. Emergency medicine units prepare for potential contamination. These are precautionary actions taken without Moscow's guidance. Click. Diplomacy grows tense. Western governments press for transparent reporting and technical data. Soviet officials respond with controlled releases and curbed access to the site. For a state that prioritized control of information, Chernobyl is a political lesson. The accident exposes how secrecy, practiced to preserve stability, can magnify danger. Inside the Soviet Union, ordinary people sense a dissonance between what they hear from the airwaves and what the instruments say. Rumour moves faster than official communiques. Click. Scientific voices insist on precision. Atmospheric chemists explain how volatile iodine travels fast and lodges in food chains. Health specialists emphasise the narrow window when potassium iodide prevents thyroid uptake. Those technical lessons are straightforward, but they depend on clear communication to reach families. Where information is withheld or delayed, the technical fix cannot be applied in time. Click. The media narrative outside the Soviet Union hardens. Chernobyl becomes shorthand for systemic failure. Critics argue that the state's secrecy converted an accident into a catastrophe. Allies of reformers note that transparency might have reduced harm and built public trust. For the Soviet leadership, damage control becomes as urgent as containment. The state mobilizes engineers, firefighters and military units to seal the area. It also seeks to control the flow of images and testimony. Click. Human stories appear at the edges of official accounts. Teachers recall children playing outdoors the morning after the explosion. Mothers remember milk set out on porches. Workers describe being told to stay on shift for repairs without clear briefings. Those small acts of normalcy, performed under poison skies, define the moral cost of secrecy. Years later, doctors link a spike in childhood thyroid cancers to those early exposures. Click. Internationally, the accident alters conversations about nuclear governance. Monitoring networks that once relayed environmental data in scientific silence become instruments of accountability. States invest in wider, faster detection systems. Agencies draft protocols for cross-border notification and food safety after radiological incidents. Chernobyl demonstrates that invisible hazards do not respect political boundaries. They force a kind of global transparency, whether states like it or not. Click. Back in the Soviet Union, the sound of denial changes toward admission. The government orders mass evacuations of tens of thousands from the immediate area. It institutes cordons and begins rationing of contaminated food. These measures arrive after foreign monitors have already sounded alarm. They are effective in parts, too late in others. The human calculus of exposure and delay becomes a subject for years of epidemiological study. Click. The recurring click is more than an onomatopoeia. It marks the moment when instruments speak louder than propaganda. It traces the path by which a local failure becomes a global story. Each click in Northern Europe carried evidence that contradicted Moscow's account. Each click narrowed the space where official silence could survive. Together, those clicks converted a wartime reflex of secrecy into a modern crisis of credibility. Click. In the end, Chernobyl stopped being a local secret when foreign detectors whispered the truth across the continent. The Soviet cover-up transformed an environmental emergency into a global contest over information. That contest reshaped how states think about transparency, early warning, and cross-border risk. It also left a generation paying a price for the hours lost to silence. Click. A birthday cake left untouched on a table. Plastic candles stuck in frosting, never blown. A toy train slept on a sunlit windowsill. A kettle cooled on a stove that would not be needed again. The evacuation notice arrived as an order, not a warning. You will leave your homes for at least 3 days. April 27th, 1986. Pripyat had been created to belong to the plant. It was the plant city, built for its engineers, operators, and families. Around 49,000 people called it home. They shared schools, shops, a concert hall, and a pride tied to the reactor. That morning, those ties unravelled with bureaucratic efficiency and human confusion. The message came from local officials and the plant administration. It travelled by loudspeaker. It travelled by radio. Some heard it from neighbours calling out windows. The tone was urgent and strangely calm. Teachers closed lessons. Kindergarten staff buckled children into small coats. A teacher wrapped one child's scarf twice without looking. A nurse in a hospital corridor read the orders and thought of her patients. She had a list of names and nothing on that list about return times. Buses were already waiting. They lined up along Lenin Avenue like a promise. Residents followed instructions with the faith of daily routine. They trusted the state that had built their city and their lives. Many took only what they stood in. A mother carried her infant with both hands and nothing else. A father left his keys on the kitchen table next to the cake. A teenager grabbed his schoolbook and his wallet and ran. An elderly woman folded a shawl and looked at her photograph. Some folded, some fumbled, some simply could not move. The official message emphasized brevity. Pack for a few days, they said. Do not panic, they said. This would be temporary, they promised. Those words shaped choices in the moment. Potassium iodide was not handed out on the streets. False reassurance interfered with life-saving choices. People assumed they would return quickly. They assumed the invisible danger would be gone by then. Assumptions became decisions. Decisions became absence. Hospitals emptied in stages. Some patients went on buses, some stayed under staff care. Doctors faced impossible arithmetic and human pleading. They tried to move fragile lives using sheets and two hands. Several patients later found themselves far from familiar faces. Shops closed and lights were switched off. A shopkeeper left bread cooling on a counter. A bakery's oven hummed for hours after its workers left. Apartment doors were left unlocked. Keys sat in coffee mugs. The evacuation was logged with lists and stamps. Officials registered names at makeshift desks. Buses pulled away in lines, plates clattering on metal steps. People waved at apartments and at strangers. Some wept quietly into the shoulders of neighbours. Not everyone left willingly. A few elderly residents refused to go. They could not imagine life divorced from the one street they knew. Families argued at doorways until officers insisted. Those tensions foreshadowed the fractures that migration would cause. Children remember it as an instant of abrupt mobility. One moment a classroom, the next a coach rumbling down a highway. They carried favourite toys and the weight of unanswered questions. They asked teachers why they could not take pets. They watched their playground shrink in the distance. Pripyat emptied in the light of a grey afternoon. Windows stared like eyes without owners. A city built for 49,000 became a series of paused rooms. Lunchboxes lay open on kitchen counters. A calendar stopped on April 26th. A temporary notice was a legal and moral pivot. It allowed authorities to move people without full disclosure. It also set the stage for permanent rupture. Parents who believed they would return soon did not reach for medical supplies. They did not salvage documents or family keepsakes. Evacuees were dispersed across the Republic. Some went to neighbouring towns, others to Kyiv or to relatives. Communities that had shared life were cast asunder. Employment tied to the plant dissolved overnight. Neighbourhood networks that held children and elders together frayed. The social cost arrived immediately and then quietly. Grief flowed in practical forms. Lost jobs, missing papers, broken routines. It arrived as a slow disorientation in new apartments and unfamiliar schools. It arrived in crowded hospitals and in the quiet of relatives' living rooms. People learned to measure loss by the things they had left behind. There was also a legal afterlife to the evacuation. Residency records were disrupted. Pensions and benefits became harder to track. Names moved through bureaucracies that were not built for such sudden mass displacement. Paperwork could not replace the neighbourhood you had lost. The plant remained a ghost at the city's edge. Its silhouette became a silent guarantor of the past. For many families, the plant had been identity and income. Removing people severed that bond. The city's purpose was now provisional and then null. People tried to return to rituals of normalcy and could not. Birthdays were celebrated in makeshift shelters without the old streets. Neighbours who were once routine companions met suddenly as strangers. Children learned new classrooms where the blackboard was cleaned by a different hand. The idea of home shifted into a series of addresses. Some residents would return illegally in later years. They called themselves self-settlers and risked radiation and punishment. They returned to collect photographs and trinkets. They returned to stand in doorways that no longer belonged to them. They left again when reality met their memory. The empty apartments of Pripyat became a map of decisions made in panic. Each abandoned plate, shoe and photograph recorded a choice. Those choices were made under a promise of a short absence. The short absence hardened into exile for whole generations. That hardening rewired family stories. Children of that evacuation grew up scattered across distant towns. They carried a shared memory of boxes and buses and the smell of old bread. They kept stories of teachers who held hands on buses and nurses who folded blankets. They inherited a narrative of trust and of betrayal. That inheritance would shape politics and personal identity. The arresting visual of an empty Pripyat does more than shock. It explains how an industrial accident becomes a social catastrophe. The physics of the core were invisible. The social effects were visible and immediate. Lives were reorganized around absence. Decisions to tell people it would be temporary mattered. They determined what was carried and what was left. They determined what people thought they should fear. They sealed the social displacement as much as any bus schedule could. This was an evacuation made legal and human by simple words. In the years that followed, photographs of empty prams and clocks stopped at strange hours circulated. They became testimony to a quiet kind of violence. Not everyone would speak about the cake on the table, but everyone felt the loss of shared streets and remembered faces. Pripyat's emptied rooms held that memory like dust. The city did not simply lose its population. It lost the continuity that anchors community and meaning. Workplaces broke apart along with neighbourhoods. Children who had known only Pripyat grew up in a set of fragmented addresses. Elders who had never left faced relocation trauma without precedent. That afternoon, the state moved people to safety. It also moved them into uncertainty. 49,000 people were removed from their routines and from each other. They were told they would return. They did not. The image that endures is simple and intimate. A cake, candles unblown, a toy on a sill, lunch boxes left open on tables. Those objects tell how an invisible hazard unmade entire lives. A simple fact, you can't see radiation. The harder facts, isotopes, half-lives, and how children's thyroids become sponges for iodine 131. After the explosion, instruments became the language of harm. Geiger counters clicked in the dark. Dosimeters recorded doses like heartbeat monitors for invisible threats. Gamma spectrometers spoke the names of the poisons. Whole-body counters later told whether food had given people cesium. But the instruments were not neutral. Many were built for routine monitoring, not catastrophe. Some dosimeters were overwhelmed and could not read the extremes. A needle at its top could look like zero danger. That false silence changed decisions on the ground. It delayed protective measures that might have prevented internal contamination. To understand the human toll, measurement must be the frame. Radiation exposure has two fundamental faces. One is immediate and violent. The other is slow and statistical. The first face is acute radiation syndrome. It appears quickly after a large dose. Nausea comes first. Vomiting follows. Hair falls out. Skin burns deepen. Bone marrow collapses, and infections take hold. Doctors use blood counts to measure damage. They use physical signs to estimate dose. They speak of sieverts and greys to translate numbers into prognosis. Around 1 sievert, people fall ill. Around 3 sieverts, outcomes become grave. Above 5 sieverts, death is likely without intensive care. In Chernobyl's first days, many firefighters and plant staff received high doses. They were exposed while running into the heart of the fire. Some stayed close to the wreckage for minutes that mattered. Doctors attempted heroic interventions. Bone marrow transplants were tried on the worst cases. Specialized hospitals in Kiev and Moscow became centers for acute care. Dozens of those responders developed acute radiation syndrome. Many died in the following weeks and months. Those deaths were immediate and tracked by beds and files. They were not arguments of statistics. They were bodies and dates. The other face is slow and measured by populations. It is cancer counted over decades. Radiation increases cancer risk probabilistically. You cannot point at one tumour and say, this was radiation. You can count tumours in a group and compare them to what you expect. That is how epidemiology speaks. That is how public health argues causation. Different isotopes write different stories across bodies and time. Iodine-131 has a short life. It decays quickly in days, but it concentrates in the thyroid. Children's thyroids are particularly active and small. They trap iodine the way sponges trap water. In Chernobyl, milk carried iodine-131 into homes. Fresh milk especially became a delivery system. Because authorities did not distribute stable iodine quickly, children's thyroids absorbed radioactive iodine. The result was measurable and tragic. In the years after the accident, pediatric thyroid cancers rose sharply in contaminated regions. Surveillance showed a clear excess above expected baselines. Thousands of children in Ukraine, Belarus and parts of Russia developed thyroid cancer. Many underwent surgery and long follow-up care. Thyroid cancer, when treated early, is often survivable. That medical fact saved lives, but the cancers could have been reduced with timely iodine prophylaxis and food restrictions. This was a direct, avoidable health consequence of delayed warnings. Cesium-137 told a different story. Its half-life is about 30 years. It behaves chemically like potassium. Plants absorb it as they take up essential minerals. Animals eat those plants. People eat the animals and the plants. That creates a food chain problem that lasts generations. Soil maps after the accident looked like weather charts of contamination. Fields marked high had to be abandoned or restricted. Whole communities lost harvests and grazing lands. Food testing programs emerged to prevent contaminated items entering markets. But the contamination constrained livelihoods in subtle, persistent ways. People avoided certain forests and rivers. Mushrooms and wild game remained contaminated long after fields seemed safe. Strontium-90 has a similar stubbornness. Its half-life is about 29 years. It mimics calcium and lodges in bones and teeth. There it can increase long-term risks for bone cancers and blood disorders. These isotopes transformed landscapes into measured zones of risk. Instruments mapped them in becquerels and counts per minute. Those numbers translated into exclusion zones, forbidden fields and permitted pastures. Measurement then became policy. Contamination thresholds decided who could farm and who could not. Those thresholds also decided who received compensation and who did not. Counting disease is also an institutional act. After Chernobyl, registries were created to track exposed cohorts. Thyroid screening programs began in schools and clinics. Ultrasound and fine needle biopsies increased detection. The screening programs produced more diagnoses. That rise was partly a medical success and partly a statistical distortion. Better surveillance finds smaller tumours that would otherwise go unnoticed. Epidemiologists adjusted for that when estimating radiation-caused cases. Their models weighed exposure estimates against observed incidents. Different models produced different death tolls over decades. Some projections ran into tens of thousands. Others remained much lower. The disagreement mattered politically as well as scientifically. Numbers became tools for compensation claims, for political narratives, and for public anxiety. That anxiety itself became measurable. Surveys documented increased stress, depression, and social disruption. Fear of radiation shaped reproductive decisions and migration choices. Abortions increased in some areas because of perceived fetal risk. Stigma followed evacuees into new towns. Counted or uncounted, those harms were real. Instruments could measure cesium in a child's body. They could not fully measure the weight of social isolation. Science tried to separate the directly caused from the indirectly produced harms. It used cohorts, control groups, and dose reconstructions. Dose reconstructions relied on measurements made too late, or not at all. That uncertainty widened the range of plausible outcomes. Still, the thyroid cancer link remained robust. That link taught a public health lesson about timing. Stable iodine distributed quickly can prevent radioactive iodine uptake. Food controls instituted early can reduce internal contamination. Those measures were not consistently applied after Chernobyl. Delay cost children their health and communities their trust. Years later, whole-body counters still found cesium in some residents. Maps from the 90s look strikingly similar to maps from the late 80s. Decay slowly diminished activity, but 30 years left a significant burden. Policy responded with long-term monitoring and land restrictions. Relief programs tried to substitute livelihoods. Some people moved away, others remained for reasons of poverty, memory, or identity. Counting disease became both science and moral accounting. It demanded that societies accept responsibility for slow-moving harm. It required sustained medical care for those affected. It required honest communication about risks and unknowns. Radiation's damage in this story is not only flash and flame, it is statistic and surgeons not. It is a burned hand and a child's medical chart filled with numbers. It is a Geiger counter's steady tick and an epidemiologist's line on a graph. Some consequences were swift and visible. Some emerged like shadows over decades. Both kinds reshaped lives, villages and national priorities. They changed how governments measure danger and how citizens demand answers. And they taught a blunt lesson about the ethics of delay. When measurement fails or is ignored, the human cost becomes larger. When instruments speak, policy must listen quickly and compassionately. The counting of disease after Chernobyl remains an act of memory and responsibility. It asks the living to care for bodies transformed into data. It asks future generations to learn how to act when the invisible speaks. Children, small bodies, thyroids hungry for iodine. That simple, terrible truth is one of the accident's most enduring legacies. They were called liquidators, soldiers, conscripts, miners, engineers. They came by the tens of thousands. They shoveled, they welded, they poured, they improvised. They used methods more like wartime improvisation than modern engineering. Soviet authorities mobilized roughly 600,000 liquidators in the months after the accident. The goal was simple on paper: stop the bleeding, limit further releases, protect millions downwind. The first orders were blunt and immediate. Helicopters dropped thousands of tons of sand, lead, boron and clay onto Reactor 4. Pilots flew low, at altitudes that would normally be forbidden. They made dozens of passes over the smoking core. Radiation cooked instruments and shortened careers within weeks. Where machines failed, humans took over. Remote-controlled devices broke almost instantly under the radiation. Electronics fried in minutes. So men went up where robots could not. They swept the roof with shovels and brooms. They chipped out chunks of burning graphite with crowbars. They scraped and shoveled the irradiated dust into metal drums. They worked with respirators, sometimes without any at all. Shifts were measured in seconds and minutes. Dosimeters clicked. Dosimeters failed. Badges recorded doses that were later lost or ignored. Many workers were sent out with a paper order and a handshake. Some were pressed, coerced, or misinformed about the risks. Some called themselves heroes. Some called themselves survivors. Most could only do the next small task in front of them. Trucks hauled away contaminated soil and debris. Cranes lifted twisted metal from the immediate blast zone. Ambulances, fire engines and bulldozers were driven into pits and buried. Those burial trenches ring the plant today as a black permanent border. Entire streets were scraped to bedrock. Personal belongings were burned or buried. Trees were cut down and stacked like cordwood to reduce future spread. Underground, another battle unfolded. Miners and tunnel crews were sent beneath the wrecked unit. They dug galleries under Reactor 4 to intercept any molten core. Their task was to catch corium before it could melt into groundwater. They installed piping and pumps and concrete barriers at dangerous depth. They worked in dark, wet tunnels with the knowledge that a new catastrophe could start at any moment. The construction of a shelter moved fast and ugly. Prefabricated steel frames and concrete panels were assembled around the ruin. Cranes loomed over radiation hotspots. Welders sealed seams where they could. Gaps were stuffed with lead and grout. Concrete was poured in long, cold runs under the eyes of officers and engineers. The structure was crude, practical, and designed to be deployed quickly. November 1986. By then, the first sarcophagus was largely completed. It was christened the Object Shelter and called the sarcophagus by everyone who saw it. It stopped the immediate collapse of the ruined core. It reduced new releases of radioactive dust and debris. But it did not clean the problem. It boxed a dangerous hot mess inside an imperfect shell. The sarcophagus was never meant to be permanent. Engineers warned that radiation and time would eat at its steel and concrete. They knew the seals were imperfect and the joints vulnerable. They knew radioactive dust and molten residues would continue to pose dangers inside. Still, the structure bought crucial time. That time mattered for the millions who might have been exposed without it. Work continued on every front. Teams decontaminated hospitals, schools and kindergartens in nearby towns. Factories and collective farms were ordered to send men and machines. Local administrators organised squads to collect contaminated foodstuffs. Letters from the plant asked for welders, for drivers, for anyone who could handle a shovel. A language of sacrifice took hold. Medals and certificates followed many who returned. Some families displayed them with pride. Those papers sometimes obscured a different reality. Many who served the cleanup later developed cancers, cataracts, and other radiation-linked illnesses. Some suffered acute radiation sickness in the months after their exposure. Many others carried invisible scars that would appear slowly over years and decades. Records remained incomplete for a long time. Some names never appeared on any official casualty list. Medical follow-up was inconsistent and often inadequate. The scale of the long-term harm among liquidators remains a subject of study and dispute. What is not disputed is the human toll felt in neighbourhoods across Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. The work of the liquidators also reshaped the physical site. Inside the sarcophagus lay tens of thousands of tons of fuel fragments, graphite and dust. That material continued to generate heat and radiation. Pipes and conduits ran through the new shelter like arteries. There were standing rooms for monitoring crews and dangerous corners that operators avoided. A strange choreography governed the work. Crane operators lifted prefabricated slabs while dosimetry teams watched closely. Welders waited for the short signal that told them the visible level had decreased. A miner crawled into a dark gallery to inspect a pipe. A driver dumped a load of contaminated soil and moved on to the next assignment. No single person saw the whole scale of the project. In the years that followed, engineers tracked deterioration. Rust and cracks appeared sooner than planners had anticipated. Water seeped into seams and carried contamination with it. The sarcophagus had to be monitored like a living thing. It required patches, reinforcements, and constant vigilance. Decades later, a second engineered solution was conceived. A vast metal arch, the new safe confinement, was designed to slide over the old shelter. Construction of the arch took years of planning and international funding. In 2016, the new structure was slid into place over the sarcophagus. It enclosed the old shelter and created a controlled space for finally dismantling the radioactive interior. That long-term fix would never have been possible without the first wave of labour. The liquidators had stabilised a disaster at a moment when collapse would have spread havoc far wider. They bought time that allowed engineers to plan, fund and build a permanent cover. They did so at great, sometimes catastrophic personal cost. Their story is less tidy than medals and official proclamations suggest. It is a story of improvisation, of courage and of bureaucratic haste. It is a story of ordinary people thrown into extraordinary danger without clear protection. It is a story written in sealed graves and in hospital records and in the slow corrosion of concrete. The cleanup was a human tsunami. Not a neat engineering program. It washed over the plant and the surrounding towns in waves of labour and sacrifice. Mass mobilisation bought time and reduced immediate danger. It did so with enormous human cost. It created an improvised shell that would need a second engineered containment decades later. What the liquidators did mattered then, and matters now. They stopped a wider catastrophe at the cost of their health, and in many cases their lives. Their labour bought engineers the decades they needed to build a safer cover. Their sacrifice remains the uneasy foundation of the shelter that still stands over Reactor 4. Their story is part of the long legacy of that night when the atom broke the world. A government memo sat on a Moscow desk. It was stamped and folded. Someone on that desk had to choose hard facts or political calm. The choice mattered for millions of lives. It mattered for the state's reputation too. The explosion at Chernobyl had already made technical problems painfully public. Radiation did not respect party lines or internal memos. For decades, the Soviet state had treated bad news as a security problem. Silence was policy. Containment meant control of facts, of speech, of fear. Mikhail Gorbachev had been in power less than 2 years. He had offered reforms under the names perestroika and glasnost. Those words promised openness, but they were still fragile. The Chernobyl accident tested them immediately. It tore at the difference between ideology and reality. The first official response was terse and defensive. Local leaders minimised the event. Minutes and wires used neutral technical language. Situation under control, read several early reports. On the ground, people were confused and frightened. Families packed and waited without clear orders. Boris Shcherbina arrived in the zone as head of the government commission. He represented the Council of Ministers in state power. Valery Legasov joined as the Commission's chief scientist. He spoke the language of experiments and measurements. Their relationship would shape the public record that followed. Shcherbina focused on logistics and immediate order. He coordinated evacuations, firefighting and temporary housing. He answered to the Politburo and to the machinery of the party. Legasov pursued scientific truth under extraordinary pressure. He insisted on real measurements and on naming technical causes. The two men disagreed about what to tell the public. Shcherbina feared panic and political damage. Legasov feared unseen danger and further harm to people. Their tensions were not personal only. They revealed a deeper institutional choice at the heart of the Soviet system. The first real rupture happened when outside governments noticed radiation. Sweden's detectors sounded an alarm. Foreign scientists tracked contamination back toward the Soviet Union. The Kremlin could no longer contain the information internally. International scrutiny forced a reckoning Moscow had not planned. Gorbachev faced the calculus directly. He chose, publicly, to speak. April 28th, 1986. He addressed the nation on television. He called the accident serious and promised fuller disclosure. That broadcast was small in length, but huge in consequence. For many Soviet citizens, it was the first honest admission in years. It undermined a long pattern of official denial. Glasnost stopped being only a policy slogan. It became a political necessity. Inside the commissions, the struggle over truth continued. Legasov pressed for public acknowledgement of design flaws. He argued that the RBMK reactor had dangerous characteristics. He wanted immediate technical reforms and international cooperation. Party officials pushed back. They feared admitting fault meant admitting systemic failure. When Legasov finally spoke at an international forum later that year, he broke a taboo. He described the reactor's positive void coefficient and the control rod design. He named risks previously concealed in internal documents. His testimony became a point of international learning and embarrassment. That learning changed worldwide nuclear governance. Countries strengthened notification agreements and safety protocols. International institutions moved to require more transparent accident reporting. Chernobyl forced those changes with a blunt moral clarity. Radiation had crossed borders. So did responsibility. At home, the political ripple was deeper and more dangerous for the Kremlin. Censorship lost moral authority. If the state could not be trusted on radiation, it could not be trusted on many things. Grassroots protests and environmental groups grew bolder. Citizens demanded answers, compensation, and accountability. National movements in Ukraine and Belarus found new audiences. People who had once deferred to central authority began to question it. Access to information allowed alternative narratives to form. That access undermined the party's traditional claim to interpret reality. The party reacted with partial concessions and new controls. Officials were dismissed or quietly reassigned. Some technical changes were ordered in reactor design across the country, but the deeper loss was political legitimacy. Once credibility cracked, it did not reseal easily. The human stories amplified the damage to authority. A mother packed a child's blanket at dawn. A firefighter carried his lungs wrapped in soot. A scientist recorded findings in a notebook that would later shock colleagues. These intimate acts contrasted with sterile phrases in government communiques. The contrast made the official language seem callous. Boris Shcherbina later defended his decisions as necessary and pragmatic. He argued that his priority had been to stop further deaths. Valery Legasov saw things differently in private and then in public. He believed truth and technical honesty were themselves instruments of safety. Legasov paid for that honesty. He lived with the moral cost of the cover-ups he had witnessed. Valery Legasov, April 29th, 1988. His death was a bitter punctuation in the story. In tapes and reports he left a record that accused the system of concealment. That record reached international audiences and domestic ears alike. It forced more people to ask how many other risks were hidden. Chernobyl accelerated a political crisis already underway. Glasnost became less of a reform and more of a demand. People wanted not just openness, but accountability and change. That demand rippled through economic reform debates and political contests. It weakened the old reflexes that had defended secrecy at any cost. On the international stage, the Soviet Union's credibility suffered. Allies and adversaries alike saw the limits of information control. Diplomacy shifted to include public safety and environmental accountability. New treaties and conventions reflected that shift, even if changes took time. The cost of secrecy was counted in many currencies. It cost immediate lives from delayed evacuations. It cost long-term trust among citizens. It cost the party's moral monopoly over truth. It cost reputations in the science and engineering communities. History does not reduce easily to a single turning point, but Chernobyl was a catalyst that made existing pressures visible. It exposed structural weaknesses in governance and in technical oversight. It accelerated debates Gorbachev could not postpone. It pushed Glasnost from rhetorical reform to political survival. In the years that followed, Soviet politics unravelled in unforeseen ways. Information flowed more freely, sometimes chaotically. Old hierarchies lost their unquestioned authority. New voices entered public space, demanding rights and redress. The memos and reports written in those first chaotic days did not remain confined. They circulated, leaked, and were debated. They changed policy and public opinion alike. A folded memo on a desk became a public reckoning. The story of Chernobyl's political aftermath is not only about a single accident. It is about how a state's relationship to truth shapes its power. When secrecy becomes the default, risk hides in paperwork. When openness becomes necessary, the state must change or lose legitimacy. The absence of candour had immediate human costs. The presence of truth reshaped politics slowly and irrevocably. Chernobyl did not alone collapse an empire, but it helped erode the authority that empire had relied upon. It left behind technical reforms and international agreements. It left behind grieving families and displaced communities. It left behind a political lesson about the cost of hiding reality. That lesson would echo through the remaining years of the Soviet Union. It would shape how citizens, scientists and leaders understood power and responsibility. In the end, the night the atom broke the world also broke an older pact between rulers and the ruled. Truth once demanded did not go quietly back into its envelope. A Ferris wheel sits rusting at the edge of a street, half swallowed by grass. Its cars hang empty, water in their rims, paint flaking in slow patterns. A deer steps through a low doorway and crosses a sunlit living room floor. It moves like a visitor taking possession of a lost city. This is a landscape shaped by sudden absence and slow succession. The official 30-kilometre exclusion zone removed thousands of square kilometres from normal use. Late April 1986. Entire towns emptied in hours as people took what they could carry and left. Fields lay fallow, orchards went untended. Markets stilled and tractors rusted. Fence lines and checkpoints turned human boundaries into a protective ring. Outside those gates, the land began to change with surprising speed. Conifer stands nearest the reactor first reddened, then fell silent and died. People called that wasteland the Red Forest, named for its burnt pines. Much contaminated topsoil was bulldozed and buried to reduce immediate spread. Fires were piled and smoke carried ash into neighbourhoods in unpredictable patterns. Those early responses left a patchwork of scars and buried hotspots. When the dust settled, grasses and pioneer trees seized the clearings quickly. Birch and aspen seedlings colonised yards and courtyards where people once walked. Rodents and birds followed the new plant growth in scattered waves. Without hunting and agriculture, food webs reorganised around abandoned crops and feral stands. Boar rooted through gardens. Foxes denned under porches. Wolves moved through atriums. Camera traps and field surveys later captured scenes that surprised many scientists. Reports showed large mammals persisting, sometimes thriving, across broad parts of the zone. Wolves increased where prey was abundant and human persecution had stopped. Wild boar multiplied in orchards that rotted quietly back into thickets. Birdlife returned in surprising diversity, from raptors to songbirds and corvids. These findings complicate simple narratives that radiation equals total ecological collapse. But complexity does not mean safety. Radiation did not disappear with the people. Hot particles, fragments of melted fuel and contaminated soils remained in many places. Those items created micro-hotspots where radiation stayed concentrated long-term. Plants can absorb cesium and strontium, dragging radioactivity into leaf and seed. Animals then ingest those radionuclides as they eat plants, fungi and smaller animals. That creates places of elevated risk embedded within landscapes that otherwise appear safe. Researchers found increased mutation rates in small mammals in the highest contamination zones. Bird studies reported smaller eggs and higher embryonic deaths in localized hotspots. Large mammals usually showed fewer obvious defects, though long-term effects can be subtle. Population numbers can recover while genetic diversity and reproductive success still suffer. Density is not the same as health in ecological terms. Maps of contamination reveal a mosaic rather than a uniformly poisoned landscape. Wind, rain, and remediation work moved radioactivity into unexpected locations. Forest fires and peat burns, sometimes resuspended, stored radionuclides into the atmosphere. Scientists now warn that a warming climate could increase such fires and releases. Animals do not respect fences or administrative lines. Elk and wolf packs move beyond the excluded area into surrounding villages and fields. That movement brings radiation into human food webs and hunting grounds sometimes. Hunters sometimes retrieve contaminated game, creating pathways back into human diets. Within the zone, a steady human presence remains for science and safety. Teams of technicians collect soil and water samples on predictable schedules and routes. They wear protective garments and maintain precise records of every measurement and exposure. These monitoring programs inform emergency planning and international standards about radiation. A small number of former residents return despite official bans and watchful patrols. They are known as Samosli, self-settlers, who choose life among ruins and gardens. Most Samosli are elderly and live minimally, often subsisting on store-bought goods. Authorities tolerate their presence with a mix of sympathy and concern. Controlled tourism has steadily grown since the 1990s, bringing thousands of visitors annually. Tourists walk marked paths through Pripyat and the surrounding ghost towns. Operators insist on rules, sealed buses, guided routes and brief exposure windows. Tourism funds research and local economies, yet it also risks trivializing loss. The zone has become one of the world's most watched ecological laboratories. Early scientific priorities focused on emergency medicine and dose reconstruction for people. Long-term studies now ask how ecosystems reorganize under dual pressures of abandonment and contamination. They examine species interactions, nutrient cycles, and evolutionary shifts across generations. Those questions matter for conservation and for understanding human impact everywhere. The zone's recovery also forces an ethical reckoning about what humans choose to leave behind. Abandonment produced an unexpected kind of wildness. It is not a reclamation of a pre-existing wilderness. It is new and strange. Radiation, ruin, and human absence combined to form novel habitats and selection pressures. Generalist species with flexible diets prospered in this altered landscape. Predators benefited from abundant prey and reduced persecution from humans. Scavengers feed on food waste left in kitchens and on roadkill in corridors. Decomposers accelerate the breakdown of built material, gradually transforming structures into soil. Roads become flowers, pavements become meadows, buildings shelter fox dens and owl roosts. Yet memory remains as an overlay to ecological change. Photographs, abandoned toys and a rusting bicycle mark where lives once clustered. Those objects give the zone its human rhythm and its moral urgency. They also attract scavengers, researchers and souvenir hunters, creating friction with protection goals. Local communities around the perimeter navigate memory, economic need and caution every day. Some farms restarted on cleaner soils, while other villages shifted towards service and tourism jobs. Chernobyl sits now at the intersection of science, politics and cultural memory. It remains a potent symbol of technological hubris and the limits of control. At the same time, it offers a surprising message about nature's capacity to occupy absence. That message is complicated, not comforting. Risk persists in soil, water and old ashes even as life flourishes elsewhere. Scientists still debate long-term health outcomes for wildlife and human populations. The zone will continue to be both a laboratory and warning for the foreseeable future. People will come to study, to remember, and sometimes simply to see the ruins. They will walk past the Ferris wheel and imagine lives interrupted in an instant. The wildlife will continue to test assumptions about resilience and vulnerability in contaminated landscapes. The technical fixes and enclosures limit some exposures but cannot erase every hot particle. Policymakers and scientists must live with uncertainty and plan accordingly. The Ferris wheel and the deer together make a clear argument about consequence and adaptation. That argument will outlive the sarcophagus, the headlines and the immediate politics of the accident. Chernobyl's zone remains at once a refuge for uninvited life and a map of human cost. This strange wilderness asks hard questions about recovery, risk and the shape of human absence. It demands long-term monitoring, thoughtful policy, and humility about technological limits. In the end, the Ferris wheel keeps turning only in memory. The deer will keep walking through rooms people once called home, and the zone will continue to teach uncomfortable truths about human designs and natural life. 30 years and more later, a giant steel arch slid into place over an aging tomb. Valery Legasov's final recordings echoed in conference rooms and court dockets. In the months after the accident, Valery Legasov spoke publicly about RBMK design flaws. He described a reactor that could flip from normal operation into a catastrophic surge. Those admissions cut through official denial like a beam through fog. 2 years later, he died by suicide. April 1988. His testimony mattered because it forced a public reckoning inside the Soviet nuclear program. Engineers redesigned control rods, and operators rewrote emergency procedures. Regulatory bodies began to ask questions formerly forbidden inside party halls. Some reactors received hardware changes to blunt the positive void coefficient. Others were shut down earlier than planners had imagined. Globally, the accident rewired the rules of nuclear governance. In 1986, international conventions formalized early notification and mutual assistance. States promised to tell one another when radiological disasters occurred. The cost of secrecy rose, the cost of cooperation fell. Back at Chernobyl, the first shelter was an act of necessity and improvisation. The hastily built sarcophagus halted clouds of radioactive dust sweeping from the wreck. It was never meant to last a lifetime. Weather and radiation gnawed at brittle concrete and rusting steel. By the turn of the century, engineers described the sarcophagus as an increasingly dangerous shell. The new safe confinement changed the frame from emergency improvisation to engineering plan. It was conceived as a machine for unmaking a ruin. Engineers built a 200-metre steel arch beside the reactor site. It travelled on rails across a concrete plinth. Then, in November 2016, it slid into place over the decayed sarcophagus. 2016. The arch covered Unit 4. The new safe confinement did three things at once. First, it sealed the environment against wind and rain that would lift contaminated dust. Second, it created a controlled work volume around the wreck. Third, it installed cranes and systems to remove the unstable debris inside. Those capabilities converted a temporary tomb into a planned dismantling program, stretching decades into the future. The structure was expected to provide shelter for 100 years while specialists extract and secure hazardous material. The project was international in funding and execution. Countries and institutions pooled money, technology and oversight. It became a visible proof that Chernobyl was no longer a purely Soviet problem. It was a global engineering and political undertaking. But a steel arch cannot erase everything. The melted fuel remains inside the reactor complex. Some of it is fused into a dense, highly radioactive mass known as corium. Robots and remote tools must be coaxed into that place. Work will continue long after the arch rusts or is repaired. The human accounting after Chernobyl remains unsettled. No single number captures lives lost, illnesses triggered, or families displaced. Estimates of long-term cancer deaths vary widely between studies and advocacy groups. Some models project a few thousand additional cancers over decades. Others suggest significantly larger totals. The disagreements stem from differences in epidemiological method and data availability. They also reflect political choices about attribution and compensation. For people on the ground, the figures are less important than memory and daily effect. Liquidators who marched across the roof and scrubbed contaminated rooms report chronic illness and contested pensions. Evacuees from Pripyat describe the ache of an abandoned childhood and a city frozen at play. Farmers from contaminated districts wrestle with lost land and uncertain livelihoods. These are ongoing costs that a balance sheet struggles to categorize. Scientists and officials trade statistics and mortality estimates in journals and reports. Survivors trade names, dates, and hospital wards. Both kinds of testimony shape the public ledger. Both kinds of testimony shape policy. The technical fixes following Chernobyl were real and consequential. RBMK reactors received redesigned control rods and automated protections. Instrumentation was modernized and training institutes rewrote syllabi. Operator culture changed slowly and unevenly. Regulators gained new tools, but not always full independence. Chernobyl also reframed the ethics of technological power. The disaster was not only a failure of design, it was also a failure of institutions and information. Decisions to withhold details stalled international help. delays exposed millions to unnecessary risk. Voices from many places became part of the chorus of reckoning. A veteran engineer called the new safe confinement a technical triumph. A liquidator remembered clouds of grit and a taste of metal in his mouth. A former resident of Pripyat still kept the label sewn into a child's coat. An IAEA official spoke of lessons carried into new safety protocols. An ecologist described surprising wildlife returning to the exclusion zone while warning about lingering contamination hotspots. These perspectives do different work. They mourn, they measure, they insist on reform. Memory and politics tangled in public forums after the accident. Gorbachev used glasnost to expose failings and to admit mistakes. That admission helped loosen information strictures across the Soviet Union. It also sparked debates about responsibility, compensation, and the cost of secrecy. Trials of plant managers and engineers followed, but public scrutiny lingered far beyond courtrooms. Chernobyl changed how states think about low probability, high consequence risks. Emergency planning grew more complicated and more international. Atomic safety rules intersected with diplomacy and public health. Countries that once treated reactors as closed systems now treated accidents as transboundary events. The site itself became an uneasy monument. Parts of the exclusion zone function as both a scientific laboratory and a living memorial. Tourists visit fenced viewpoints and museums that catalogue toys and school desks. Researchers monitor radiation, wildlife, and human return narratives. The zone is at once a place of fascination and a site of ongoing harm. There is a stubborn ethical question at Chernobyl's heart. How much transparency is required to manage dangerous technology in a free society? How do we weigh economic ambition against safety margins? What obligations do states owe to neighbours who may bear the cost of an accident? Those questions have no single answer. They are choices that must be debated openly, not deferred by bureaucracy. They are legal and moral and technical at once. Valery Legasov left a warning about that tangled mix. He named design failures. He named cultural failures. He tried to make the record available to scientists and history. His death became part of the lesson the world wrestled with thereafter. The new safe confinement stands as a new chapter in that lesson. It is a gesture of repair and a commitment to meticulous work ahead. It mitigates immediate risk and buys time for careful dismantling. It does not erase the human losses nor the ecological disruptions. Chernobyl is not a closed story. The archroof's a ruin, but it does not close a debate about secrecy, responsibility and governance. These are living matters for courts, parliaments and scientists. They will persist as long as humans build machines that can exceed our ability to control them. The archive of recordings, the towers of steel, the reports and the testimonies all insist on one thing. Power without accountable oversight is invitation to catastrophe. Technology designed without openness amplifies human error. Secrecy multiplies consequences. As the world watches the arch shelter settle into place, the primary question remains: will nations learn to structure power with humility and oversight? Will they fund institutions that demand transparency and prepare neighbours for shared risk? Answers will shape the next generation of technologies and the citizens who inherit them. For now, the arch covers the ruin. Voices continue to sift what it means to live after such a failure. Chernobyl endures not only as a memory of loss, it endures as an ongoing lesson about how human choices shape the risks we accept and the future we build.